At 11 o'clock on the morning of December 23, 1950, a gray American freighter backed away from a pier in North Korea with so many human beings on her deck that you could not see the deck. Not the hatch covers, not the winches, not the paint. From the bridge, 40 feet up, her captain looked down on a single living surface of white cotton coats and black hair and breath rising in the cold, packed so tightly that if one person had fallen, there would have been nowhere to fall. The ship was 455 feet long. She had been built to carry 12 passengers. By the best count anyone ever made, she was carrying 14,000. She had no doctor, no interpreter, no heat below decks, no lights in the holds, no toilets for the people standing in them, and no equipment of any kind for finding the mines that the enemy had sown across the harbor she was about to leave. Her captain's only weapon was a pistol in the pocket of his coat. Ahead of her lay 450 nautical miles of winter sea, and behind her, closing on the last American perimeter around the port of Hungnam, were the Chinese armies that had just driven the United Nations out of North Korea. The weather report called for freezing temperatures and rough water. The calendar said it was 2 days until Christmas. This is the story of the SS Meredith Victory, of the 47 merchant seamen who sailed her, and of the quiet man on her bridge, Leonard LaRue, who would later say that God's own hand had been at the helm. It is the largest rescue by a single ship in recorded history. 5 babies were born during it. Not one person died. And in the United States, the country that built the ship and crewed her, almost nobody has heard of it. Partly because the Korean War was forgotten almost as soon as it ended, and partly because the captain spent the last half of his life in a monastery, refusing to talk about himself at all. To understand what happened at Hungnam, you have to go back 6 weeks, to November of 1950, when the war in Korea looked like it was over. United Nations forces under General Douglas MacArthur had pushed the North Korean army all the way to the Yalu River, the border with China, and American soldiers were being told they would be home by Christmas. Then, in the last week of November, something like 250,000 Chinese soldiers who were not supposed to be there came out of the mountains in the snow. The UN 10th Corps on the east side of the peninsula was suddenly cut off, outnumbered, and 100 miles from the sea. What followed was one of the hardest fighting withdrawals in American history. The 1st Marine Division and Army units around a frozen lake called the Chosin Reservoir fought their way south through Chinese roadblocks in temperatures that fell to 30 below zero. Men's rations froze. Men's rifles froze. The wounded were strapped to the hoods of jeeps because the heat of the engine was the only warmth for 60 miles. The road from Chosin ran down out of the mountains to a port city on the Sea of Japan, and that port was the only way out for every soldier and Marine on that side of Korea. Its name was Hungnam. By the 2nd week of December, Hungnam had become the last door. The plan was to hold a shrinking perimeter around the harbor, while the United States Navy brought in every hull it could find and took the entire 10th Corps off the beach. More than 100,000 troops, 17,000 vehicles, hundreds of thousands of tons of supplies. It was, people said at the time, Dunkirk with a better navy. Battleship guns fired over the city day and night to keep the Chinese off the perimeter. And into that perimeter from every road in North Korea came something the plan had not fully accounted for. Civilians, tens of thousands of them. They came on foot, in the snow, carrying what they owned. Old men with wooden A-frame carriers on their backs. Women with babies wrapped against their chests and pots tied to their bundles. Children holding a rope so they would not be separated. They were Christians who feared the communists, farmers whose villages had been fought over 3 times, families of men who had worked for the South or for the Americans, and many who simply did not want to live under the government that was coming back. By the middle of December, there were close to 100,000 of them crowded against the harbor, sleeping in the open, and the sea in front of them was the only direction that did not end in a Chinese army. The American plan did not include them, not out of cruelty, out of arithmetic. Every ship at Hungnam was needed for soldiers and guns and ammunition, and every hour the perimeter held cost lives. But 2 men inside the 10th Corps headquarters refused to accept the arithmetic. One was a Marine colonel named Edward Forney, who had been put in charge of the evacuation's logistics and who began quietly finding room. The other was a 28-year-old Korean doctor named Hyun Bong-hak, an American-educated physician serving as a civil affairs advisor, who went to the general in command and told him plainly what would happen to the people on that beach when the last ship left. The General Edward Almond listened. Then he gave the order, take the civilians too, as many as possible. As many as possible turned out to be a question of ships, and one of the ships that happened to be at Hungnam that week was not a warship at all. She was a freighter. The SS Meredith Victory had been launched in Los Angeles in June of 1945, one of hundreds of cheap, fast cargo ships the United States built during the Second World War and called Victory ships. She was 455 feet long, 62 feet wide, with 5 cargo holds and a top speed of about 15 knots. She was owned by the government, operated by a New York company called Moore McCormack Lines, and chartered to the military to haul supplies to Korea. Her accommodations, if you were generous, could hold 12 passengers. Her master was a 36-year-old Philadelphian named Leonard LaRue. He had graduated from the Pennsylvania Nautical School in 1934, had spent the Second World War on the Murmansk Run, the Arctic convoy route to Russia where German submarines and the cold killed men in about equal numbers, and he had the manner that kind of experience tends to leave behind. Quiet, precise, not given to speeches. He was a devout Catholic who kept a rosary in his coat, and he had a habit, his officers later remembered, of thinking for a long moment before answering and then not changing his mind. Under him were 46 men. His first mate was Dino Savastio, a stocky, steady seaman whose medical qualifications consisted of a first aid course and a canvas bag with bandages in it. His staff officer was Robert Lunny, 23, a young man fresh enough to the sea that he still wrote things down. His junior third mate was Burley Smith, 22, who had graduated from the Merchant Marine Academy that same year and had been at sea for a matter of months. The rest were engineers, oilers, deckhands, cooks, a radio man, merchant sailors, civilians under contract, not one of them a soldier. In the second week of December, they brought the Meredith Victory up the Korean coast with a hold full of military cargo, and by most accounts, drums of jet fuel still stacked below. They arrived at a harbor that looked like the end of the world. Hungnam was ringed by fire. To the north and west, along the hills, American artillery and the 16-inch guns of a battleship were firing around the clock, and the flashes lit the low clouds orange. In the harbor, dozens of ships rode at anchor or waited their turn at the piers while landing craft shuttled back and forth. On the waterfront, under the smoke, was the thing the crew of the Meredith Victory had not been told about. A crowd so large it had no edges, standing in the snow along the seawall and the railroad yards and the beach facing the water, waiting. Burley Smith, looking at it from the rail, would say it reminded him of Times Square on New Year's Eve, except that no one was celebrating and no one was going home. On December 20th, a launch came alongside the Meredith Victory, and 2 United States Army colonels climbed the ladder to the deck. Dr. Hyun was with them. What they asked Captain LaRue in his small cabin under the bridge was not an order, because they had no authority to give a civilian shipmaster an order. It was a question. The harbor was being emptied. Every warship and transport was already assigned. There were tens of thousands of civilians on the waterfront, and the perimeter was going to close in a matter of days. Would he take some of them? LaRue, the officers remembered, did not answer immediately. He asked what some meant. The colonel said, as many as you can. There were reasons to say no, and every one of them was a good reason. The ship was a freighter. She had no life jackets for passengers, no food for them, no water system that could supply more than her own crew, no heat in the cargo holds, no way down into those holds except ladders. She was carrying military cargo that the Army wanted delivered. She would be sailing through mined waters with no mine detection gear in December in the Sea of Japan. And if anything went wrong with thousands of people in her holds, a fire, a mine, a storm, there would be no help and no second chance. Any captain who refused would have been within his rights. Nobody would have remembered his name. LaRue went up to the bridge wing and looked at the waterfront for a while. Then he came back down and said yes. He would later describe the decision in fewer words than it takes to say it. I thought of the people, he said. That was all. He told the colonels to start sending them. He told Savastio to find every cargo net on the ship and rig them over the side, because the gangway alone would never be enough. He told the chief engineer to keep steam up and the galley to cook everything they had. And he told the crew, in the plain language of a man who had done the Murmansk run, that they were going to load this ship until there was no room left, and then they were going to load it some more. First they had to make room. Through the 21st and into the 22nd, the Meredith Victory's crew and Army stevedores worked the booms, swinging pallets of cargo up out of the holds and onto the pier. Guns, supplies, equipment the Army had meant to ship south and now had to leave or load somewhere else. Not everything came out. By most accounts, drums of jet fuel stayed stacked in the lower holds because there was no time and nowhere to put them. So the plan, such as it was, became this. Human beings would be loaded into the same steel compartments as aviation fuel, in the dark, and the ship would sail through a minefield and everyone would hope. On the afternoon of December 22nd, the first of them came across. Army engineers had rigged an improvised bridge of planks from the pier to the ship's side, and Savastio's men had hung cargo nets down the hull for those who could climb. The first refugees hesitated at the edge of the pier, looking at the gray wall of the ship, at the nets, at the American sailors waving them forward. Then an old man with an A-frame on his back stepped onto the planks, and a woman followed him, and then the line behind them began to move, and it did not stop moving for 18 hours. There was a young Korean doctor on the pier that afternoon who understood what he was watching. Hyun Bong-hak had spent weeks fighting for this. He had translated, argued, pleaded, and lied about paperwork to get civilians onto Navy ships. Now he stood at the foot of the gangway of a freighter that had no business carrying passengers, counting people as they went up, and the count was already in the thousands. He knew what was in the holds. He knew about the mines. He also knew what was waiting on that beach for anyone still standing on it when the last ship left. He kept counting. The holds of a Victory ship are steel boxes, 5 of them, stacked in 2 levels, lit by nothing but the square of gray sky at the top of the hatch. The crew sent the refugees down into them by ladder, lower holds first, and when the lower holds were full, they dropped the hatch covers, which became the floor of the upper holds, and filled those. Savastio stood at the hatch combings with a flashlight, signaling people down, packing them in as he put it, like sardines. Standing room only, then less than standing room. People pressed shoulder to shoulder, bundles on their heads, children lifted onto shoulders in a dark that smelled of fuel oil and cold steel and fear. Burley Smith, 22 years old, was on the pier, and what he remembered most was the sound, or rather its absence. Thousands of people were crowding toward a ship that might be their only chance to live, and there was almost no shouting, no shoving, no panic. Families held hands. Mothers counted children. When a sailor pointed, people went where he pointed. Smith said later that it was the most orderly crowd he had ever seen, and that he had never forgotten it. The Koreans on the dock, he said. To me, that's what we were there for. Imagine a woman named Sun-hee. She is not one person. She is a composite of the hundreds of women on that pier who were carrying a baby in their arms and another one, very nearly due, under their coats. She had walked from a village north of the city with her mother and her husband. Somewhere on the road her husband had been separated, and she had waited a day at a crossroads, and then, when the artillery got closer, she had not waited any longer. At the foot of the gangway a sailor looked at her belly, looked at her face, and pointed her not down into the holds but up, toward the deck. She did not understand him. She understood the pointing. Behind her came a man we will call Grandfather Park, 70 years old, a jeej on his back loaded with a rolled quilt, a brass pot, and a bag of barley, and a 6-year-old grandson named Minho gripping the hem of his coat. At the top of the plank bridge, a sailor reached for the A-frame to help him down, and the old man, without a word, took it off and set it on the pier behind him, and took the boy's hand and went up. There was no room for the jeej. There was no room for anything. All along the pier, the refugees were learning the same lesson at the same moment, and a line of abandoned bundles began to grow behind them like a tide line. Some did not learn it in time. Out on the water, along the ship's side, families who had climbed the cargo nets with everything they owned, still tied to them, reached the rail and found sailors taking it from them, pots, bedding, sacks of rice, and dropping it into the harbor to make room for one more person. Those who watched it from the deck remembered the bundles floating for a moment and then sinking, white cloth going gray in the oily water. One sailor, the stories say, wept while he did it. He kept doing it. By nightfall, the holds were full and the deck began to fill. The Meredith Victory's main deck is a working deck. Hatch covers, winches, cargo booms, ventilators, a narrow alley along each rail. By midnight, every inch of it was occupied. People sat on the hatch covers in rows, knees drawn up. People stood in the alleys. People climbed onto the winches and lay along the cargo booms. Snow had begun to fall, and it settled on the shoulders of the crowd and did not melt, because there was no warmth to melt it. Lunny, walking the deck with a flashlight, tried to keep account for the log. He gave up somewhere past 10,000. And still they came. Through the night of December 22nd, while the guns fired behind them and the sky over the perimeter flashed and rumbled, the line of refugees kept crossing the planks and climbing the nets in the dark. The crew worked without sleep. There was nothing to eat, because there was no way to feed 14,000 people from a freighter's galley, and there was very little water, and the only thing the sailors could give was room. Another foot of deck, another rung of the ladder, a hand reaching down over the rail. Sometime before dawn, a mother handed a baby up the net ahead of her, and a sailor held it while she climbed, and she took it back without a word, and the sailor went back to the rail for the next one. Captain LaRue spent the night on the bridge and on the deck, saying little. He checked the load. He checked the harbor, where the lights of the other ships were going out one by one as they finished loading and stood out to sea. He listened to the guns and tried to judge, from their rhythm, how much time the perimeter had left. Sometime in the small hours, a Navy officer came alongside and told him he should prepare to sail at first light. LaRue asked how many were still on the pier. The answer was, "More than you can take." He asked the Navy officer to keep sending them until the moment he cast off. In the holds, the night was worse. The people down there could not sit, they could not see. They could smell the fuel, and many of them knew what it was. Children cried and were hushed. Somewhere in number 3, hold, a man began to sing, quietly, a hymn, and others who knew it joined, and the sound came up through the open hatch into the snow. The crew did not understand the words. Several of them said later it was the moment they understood what they were carrying. Not cargo, not even refugees. Congregations, families, an entire city's worth of people who had decided to trust a ship. Dawn on December 23rd came gray and bitter. The Meredith Victory sat low in the water, lower than she had ever sat loaded with steel, and from the pier she no longer looked like a ship so much as a hill covered with people. The plank bridge was still crowded. The nets were still full of climbers. On the bridge, LaRue looked at the perimeter, where the shelling had grown closer through the night, and at the tide, and at the crowd, and made the kind of decision that captains are paid to make and never forgiven for. He gave the order to prepare to cast off. Sevastio's men began pulling in the nets, and the last climbers were hauled over the rail by their arms. Soldiers on the pier held the crowd back from the plank bridge so it could be pulled away, and the people at the front, who had been next, stood looking at the gap of water that opened between them and the ship and grew wider. Some were lifted onto landing craft and taken to other ships. Some got out. The Hungnam evacuation would eventually carry close to 100,000 civilians to the south, on nearly 200 ships and craft. But on that pier, at that hour, the ones who watched the Meredith Victory's lines come in could not know that. They only knew that the ship was leaving, and that they were not on it. On the bridge, LaRue rang for slow astern. He had no tugs. He had 14,000 people standing on every surface of his ship, a crew that had not slept in 2 days, a harbor full of anchored vessels, and beyond the breakwater, a field of mines that no one had charted for him. At 11 o'clock in the morning on December 23, 1950, the Meredith Victory backed away from the pier at Hungnam, swung her bow toward the open sea, and sounded her whistle once. 14,000 people heard it. For most of them, it was the last sound they would ever hear in the north. The first danger was not the Chinese and not the cold, it was the water itself. The approaches to Hungnam had been mined, and the swept channel out of the harbor was narrow, marked by buoys and by the wrecks of vessels that had not found it. A warship would have had sonar, a mine countermeasures escort, and a navigation team. The Meredith Victory had a compass, a chart, a helmsman, and a captain who had learned his trade on the Murmansk run, where you watched the water ahead of you every minute of every watch because the thing that killed you did not announce itself. LaRue took the con himself and brought her out at dead slow. From the bridge wing, the ship ahead of him was a sea of heads. There was no clear view of the bow. Lookouts had to be posted on the forecastle, standing among the refugees, calling back what they saw. Lunny later remembered the strange quiet of it, the engine barely turning, the hull creaking under a load it was never designed for, the sound of thousands of people breathing, and the gray water sliding past with nothing visible in it and everything possible. It took the better part of an hour to clear the swept channel. When the last buoy fell astern and the ship came round to the south, LaRue let out a breath and rang for more speed, and the Meredith Victory, 14,000 souls aboard, set her course for Pusan, 450 nautical miles away. Behind her, Hungnam burned. The evacuation would go on for one more day. On December 24th, the last American troops came off the beach under the guns of the fleet, and Navy demolition teams blew the port. The piers, the cranes, the railroad yards, the stockpiles that could not be carried, in a series of explosions so large that the smoke could be seen for miles out to sea. The people on the Meredith Victory did not see it. They were already over the horizon. But many of them, years later, when they described that morning, described the sound of the ship's whistle and then the feeling of the deck beginning to move, and then turning to look at the shore and finding, for the first time in weeks, that nothing was chasing them. Dino Savastio had a different problem. Somewhere in the afternoon of the 23rd, a sailor came to find him with an urgency that did not need translating, and led him down a ladder into one of the holds, into the dark, to a place where the crowd had managed to make a small hollow in itself, and in the hollow was a woman on the deck plates with other women around her. She was in labor. There was no doctor on the ship. There was no nurse. There was a first mate with a first aid course and a canvas bag, a flashlight held by another sailor, and a few hundred silent witnesses. Savastio knelt down on the steel and did what he could, and a baby was born on the SS Meredith Victory at sea. The crew could not pronounce the Korean names the mothers gave their children, and in the way of sailors they gave the babies names of their own. The first one born they called Kimchi One. It was not a joke. It was affection, and a way of keeping count because Savastio was fairly sure there would be more. There were. Before the voyage was over there would be 5, Kimchi 1 through Kimchi 5, every one of them delivered in the dark, on steel, by a merchant seaman who had never done it before, and every one of them alive. Decades later, at least 2 of those babies, grown men by then, would stand on a pier in South Korea and tell the story of the freighter they were born on. Then came the part no one tells you about rescues. The waiting. The Meredith Victory could make 15 knots at best. Loaded as she was, she made less. 450 miles meant something like 28 hours at sea, and for 14,000 people that meant 28 hours standing. In the holds, there was not room to sit. On deck, the people who sat could not stand again without losing their place. It was well below freezing. The wind off the Sea of Japan in December comes down from Siberia and does not stop for anything. There was no heat, there was no food to speak of, and the water the crew could pass down was a cup here and a cup there in a crowd of thousands. Imagine the young mother again, Sun-hee, on the deck near the bow, where a sailor had put her because it was upwind of the worst of the smoke. She had her baby inside her coat against her skin the way the other women showed her because that was the only heat there was. She had not eaten since the day before the pier. She had stopped being able to feel her feet sometime in the night. Every hour or so a sailor pushed through the crowd with a bucket and a tin cup, and every time the cup came to her she drank one swallow and held the rest to the lips of the woman beside her, and the woman did the same for the next. Nobody told them to do that. It was simply what was done. Below decks, the dark had its own rules. The people in the holds could not see the sea and could not see the sky, and the only light came down through the open hatch squares and did not reach the corners. The smell of fuel was constant. There were no toilets. People did what people must, where they stood, and the smell of that joined the smell of the fuel, and there was nothing to be done about it, and no one complained. When someone fainted, the people around them held them upright, because there was nowhere to lie down. When a child was lost, the crowd passed the child hand over hand until someone shouted a name and a hand reached up. The hold did not panic, not once in 28 hours. Grandfather Park stood against a bulkhead in number 2 hold with Minho on his feet, the boy's shoes on his own shoes so the child would not be crushed, and the rice bowl the boy had refused to give up pressed between them. Once in the night, the boy asked where they were going. The old man said, "South." The boy asked what was south. The old man said, "The sea, and then an island, and then a place where nobody is shooting." He did not know if it was true. He said it the way you say a thing to a child, which is to say with enough certainty that you begin to believe it yourself. Around them, 1,000 other grandfathers were saying something very like it. The crew did not sleep. 47 men on their third day without rest kept the boilers fed, the helm steady, the pumps running and the lookouts posted, and in every spare minute went down among the people. Lunny kept his log. Smith worked the deck, hauling water buckets and lifting children to their parents' arms. Savastio went from hold to hold with his flashlight in his bag, and somewhere in the night delivered the second baby and then the third. The ship's cook, whose name the records do not bother to save, made what he could from what he had and sent it out in the hands of sailors, and 14,000 people shared it in mouthfuls. On the bridge, LaRue watched the sea. He had a pistol in one pocket and a rosary in the other, and he did not by any account take out either one. His officers remembered him standing for hours at the forward windows without speaking, and when he did speak, it was about the ship. Her trim, her course, the state of the engines, the weather. He was not a man who showed fear, and he was not a man who showed anything else, and perhaps that was the gift. 14,000 people who could not see him, and 46 who could, were held steady in the dark by the simple fact that the captain was on the bridge and the captain was not worried, or did not appear to be. At sea, those are the same thing. Sometime after midnight, the weather worsened. The Meredith Victory began to roll, not dangerously, a sailor would have said, but on a deck packed with people who had never been on a ship. Every roll was a wave of bodies leaning together, steadying, leaning back, a sound of thousands of feet shifting on steel, and a murmur that rose and fell with it. Some were sick. Many prayed. In one of the holds the singing began again, the same hymn as the night before, and this time the sailors who heard it came to know the tune, and 1 or 2 of them hummed it as they worked. They did not know the words meant anything about God. They only knew it was what the people sang when they were afraid, and that it helped. There was one thing the crew did not talk about with each other, and that was the fuel. If a mine had found the hull, if a fire had started in the holds, if anything at all had happened to a ship carrying aviation fuel and 14,000 people, there would have been nothing to do. No boats, no room to reach them. No one to come. LaRue knew it, Savastio knew it. Every man aboard who had been to sea knew it. They had decided, each on his own, on the pier at Hungnam, that the alternative was worse, and having decided, they did not revisit the question. That is also what courage looks like. Not the absence of fear, the refusal to do arithmetic twice. By the morning of December 24th, the coast of South Korea was in sight, and the people on deck who could see it began to point. They had been told the name of the place, Busan, the great port at the southern tip of the peninsula, the capital of the war, the place that had held out when nothing else did. To the refugees it meant the end of the voyage, warmth, water, the ground not moving, the chance to sit down. The Meredith Victory came up the approaches to Busan Harbor in the early afternoon of Christmas Eve, her whistle sounding, her rails lined with faces, and dropped anchor, and then nothing happened. What the people on deck could not know was that Busan was already drowning. In 6 months the city had swollen with more than 1 million refugees from every corner of Korea, and the Hungnam ships arriving all week had poured tens of thousands more onto its piers. There was no room. There was no food. The port authorities, looking at one more freighter with a hill of people on it, sent a launch out with a message that the captain had to hear and the refugees were spared hearing. The Meredith Victory could not unload. Only the wounded could come off, and a handful of men the authorities wanted to question. Everyone else would have to go somewhere else. LaRue received the order the way he received everything, which was without visible reaction, and then asked where somewhere else was. The answer was an island called Kojedo, Geoje, as it is spelled today, about 50 miles to the southwest, where a refugee camp was being built. 50 more miles, several more hours. Another night aboard for 14,000 people who had already stood for a day and a half in the cold without food. The crew took on what water they could. A few of the most desperately ill were taken ashore, and as the light went out of Christmas Eve, the Meredith Victory weighed anchor and turned away from the lights of Pusan, and the people on deck who had been pointing lowered their arms. Sun-hee, we will say, was near the rail when the ship turned, and she understood before anyone explained it that they were not getting off. She did not cry. There was no strength left for that. She shifted the baby against her chest, found the woman beside her in the dark, and leaned into her, and the woman leaned back, and the two of them stood that way through the night of Christmas Eve, 1950, on the open deck of an American freighter, off the coast of a country they had never seen, while the fourth baby was born somewhere below them, and the crew passed the word up through the crowd, hold by hold, in a language the mothers did not speak. Kimchi 4. On the bridge, LaRue set the course for Kojedo, and his officers later said stood for a long moment at the chart table before he spoke. It was Christmas Eve. He was a devout man, and he knew what night it was, and he knew what he had in his holds. A multitude with no room, and a berth and another berth, and whatever he thought about that, he kept it to himself until many years later. What he said at the chart table was the course and the speed. Then he went out onto the bridge wing into the wind, and stayed there until the island's light came up over the bow. Kojedo rose out of the dawn of December 25, 1950, as a line of green hills. Green after weeks of snow and mud and gray water, and the people on the deck of the Meredith Victory who had the strength to stand saw it before the crew did. A sound went through the ship that none of the sailors had heard in 3 days. Not a cheer. They did not have the breath for a cheer. Something lower. A murmur of 14,000 people who had just understood that they were going to live, passed from the rail to the hatch covers, to the open squares of the holds, and down into the dark, where people who could not see anything at all began, quietly, to weep. The ship could not go alongside. Kojedo had no pier that could take a loaded Victory ship, and the Meredith Victory anchored off the island and waited while Navy landing craft, the same flat-bottomed LSTs that had taken soldiers off the beach at Hungnam, came out to her side. Then the whole thing had to happen in reverse. The nets went back over the rail. The refugees, who had climbed up them in the dark at Hungnam, now climbed down them in daylight into the landing craft, a few hundred at a time, and the landing craft ran to the beach and came back, and the crew counted them off the way they had counted them on, and the numbers were the same. It took the rest of Christmas Day and most of the next. Unloading 14,000 people from a ship by cargo net into landing craft is slow, careful work, and the crew of the Meredith Victory, who had now been awake for most of 4 days, did it one person at a time. Children were handed down the nets from sailor to sailor. The old were lowered in slings. The mothers with the 5 newborns were brought up out of the holds and helped down with the babies bound against them, Savastio himself at the rail for each one, by the accounts of men who were there, making sure. And on the beach the people who had been first down the nets waited for the people who had been last, so that families could find each other in the crowd. Somewhere in that crowd, on that beach, Grandfather Park set Minho down on the sand and looked at the hills, and then at the boy, and then at the sea behind them, where the gray ship sat with the landing craft crawling back and forth beside her. He had left a jeege, a quilt, a brass pot, and a sack of barley on a pier in the north, and a house in a field and a family grave before that. He had a rice bowl, a grandson, and the coat he stood in. He told the boy to sit, and the boy sat, and the old man sat beside him, and for the first time in a month there was no reason to get up. We have invented these two. We have not invented the thousands they stand for. Sun-hee went down the net with the baby inside her coat and her feet that she could not feel, and a sailor at the bottom caught her by the arms and set her in the landing craft, and a woman she had stood beside for a day and a half sat down next to her and took her hand. On the beach there was a soldier with a list and an interpreter with a megaphone, and rice, actual rice, cooking somewhere, and a tent. The child she was carrying would be born, in the composite of this story, a few weeks later on that island, in that camp, into a country she had never seen and a peace that did not yet exist. In the real history, a great many children were. Late on December 26th, the last landing craft pulled away from the side of the Meredith Victory, and the last of the refugees went ashore. Lunny closed his log, a count that would later be accepted by the Navy, by the Korean government, by the people who keep such records, was more than 14,000 people embarked at Hungnam, and more than 14,000 people disembarked at Kojedo, plus 5, the 5 born at sea. Not one person had died. Not of the cold, not of hunger, not of the crush, not of the sea. In 28 hours of voyage and 3 days aboard, on a freighter with no doctor and no heat and fuel in her holds, the count had gone up, not down. The crew did not celebrate. There is no record of it. There was a ship to clean, and it needed cleaning in a way that no ship should, and there were orders waiting. More cargo, more voyages, a war that was not over and would not be over for 2.5 more years. The men who had stood at the rail for 3 days went back to their watches. LaRue wrote his report. It was, the people who read it said, brief. A few of the sailors went ashore on Kojedo for an hour and walked among the refugees, who did not have the words to thank them and thanked them anyway, with their hands and their faces. Then the Meredith Victory weighed anchor and went back to work. Here's what the people on the beach could not know. Behind them, Hungnam was gone. On the afternoon of December 24th, the last American units had come off under the fire of the fleet, and Navy demolition teams had blown the port, the piers, the cranes, the rail yards, the mountains of stores that could not be carried, in a string of explosions that sent smoke miles into the sky. The Chinese walked into a harbor of rubble. The evacuation was over. In 2 weeks, the Navy had taken off more than 100,000 troops, 17,000 vehicles, 350,000 tons of cargo, and something like 98,000 civilians, on nearly 200 ships and craft, of which one freighter built for 12 passengers had carried a 7th. There were other ships at Hungnam that carried civilians, and other captains who said yes, and they deserved their own stories. What made the Meredith Victory different was scale, and the particular stubborn way her crew refused to treat scale as a reason. A freighter is not a passenger ship. A first mate is not a doctor. 47 men are not enough for 14,000. Every one of those sentences is true, and every one of them was, on December 22, 1950, a perfectly good reason to take 1,000 people and sail. They took 14,000. And then, for a day and a half, they treated each of the 14,000 as if that person were the only one aboard. Years afterward, asked about it, Leonard LaRue gave an answer that has been quoted ever since, and it is worth hearing in full because it tells you what kind of man was on the bridge. He said he thought often of that voyage, of how such a small vessel was able to hold so many persons and surmount endless perils without harm to a soul. And he said that as he thought about it, the clear, unmistakable message came to him that on that Christmastide, in the bleak and bitter waters off the shores of Korea, God's own hand was at the helm of his ship. He did not say his own hand. He never did. Dino Savastio went back to being a first mate. Burley Smith went on to a long career at sea and, much later, to telling the story to anyone who would listen, because he thought it mattered that someone did. Robert Lunny went home, went to law school, became an attorney and a Navy Reserve officer, and for the rest of his life kept the memory of the Meredith Victory alive, writing, speaking, answering letters from Koreans who wanted to know about the ship their parents had come south on. He lived to see the crew honored. He lived to see the babies grow old. He was the last of the officers, and he carried it a long way. As for the ship, the Meredith Victory went back to hauling cargo for the rest of the Korean War, was laid up in 1952 and sat in a reserve fleet for 14 years. In 1966, she was brought out again and converted to carry troops to another war in Vietnam. She did that too without ceremony. And in 1993, old and tired, she was towed to China and cut up for scrap, which is the end of most ships and which does not care what they carried. Somewhere in the steel of 1,000 other things, there is a victory ship that once held a city. But the country she had carried the city to did not forget. In 1955, the Republic of Korea gave Leonard LaRue its Gold Star Order of Military Merit. In 1958, President Syngman Rhee gave the captain and crew the Korean Presidential Citation. In 1960, the United States finally caught up. The crew received the Merchant Marine Meritorious Service Medal, and by a special act of Congress signed by President Eisenhower, the Meredith Victory was named a gallant ship, one of a tiny handful of merchant vessels ever given that title. Decades later, the Guinness Book of Records would list her for the largest evacuation from land by a single ship, 14,000. The number has never been beaten. And then Leonard LaRue did the thing that, more than anything else, is the reason you have probably never heard his name. He left, not the ship, the sea. In 1954, 4 years after Hungnam, at the age of 40, the man who had commanded the largest rescue in maritime history walked through the door of St. Paul's Abbey, a Benedictine monastery in the hills of Newton, New Jersey, and asked to be admitted as a brother. He was. He took the name Marinus, the one from the sea, and he spent the next 47 years there under the Benedictine rule of prayer and work. Ora et labora. He prayed, he worked, he did not give interviews. People who knew him at the Abbey described a quiet man who kept the grounds, tended the gift shop, served at meals, and did not talk about Korea unless someone else raised it. And then only briefly. When the Korean medals came, he accepted them and put them away. When a writer came, decades later, to ask him about the Meredith Victory, he answered the questions, politely and without decoration. And when the writer asked whether he thought of himself as a hero, Brother Marinus said, in effect, that he thought of himself as a man who had been at the helm of a ship and that the rest was in other hands. He said it the way he had said the course and the speed at the chart table on Christmas Eve. He died at the Abbey on October 14, 2001, at the age of 87. His obituary ran in a few newspapers and was short, and that might have been the end of it in America at least, except that the story had a life of its own in the other country, the one the ship had sailed to. In South Korea, the Hungnam evacuation was not a footnote. It was a national memory, the kind of thing grandparents told grandchildren. In 2014, a Korean film about a family separated at Hungnam became one of the biggest box office hits in the country's history. And in 2017, the son of two of the Meredith Victory's refugees was elected president of the Republic of Korea. His name is Moon Jae-in. His parents, Moon Young-hyung and Kang Han-ok, came down the nets at Hungnam in December of 1950, stood in the holds for a day and a half, and walked ashore at Kojedo. He was born on that island 3 years later. When he visited the United States as president, he went to the Marine Corps Museum in Virginia and spoke about the evacuation, and about a freighter, and about the fact that he would not exist without it. Somewhere in the tens of thousands, by some estimates far more, of living descendants of the people who came off that ship, there is a head of state. There are doctors and pastors and farmers and a great many grandmothers. There were, to begin with, 5 babies. 2 of them are known to the world today. Kim Chi-won, the first baby Savastio delivered in the hold on the afternoon of December 23rd, grew up to be a man named Son Yang-young. Kim Chi-5, born as the ship reached Kojedu on Christmas Day, became Lee Gyung-pil, who has spent his later years telling the story of his own birth to anyone who asks. At the 75th anniversary, in 2025, the 2 of them were among the last living links to the voyage, gray-haired men who had never seen the deck they were born under, standing for photographs beside the descendants of the crew. One of them was asked what he would say to the sailors. He said, "Thank you for my life, it was not a figure of speech." Why did the story vanish in the United States? There are 3 reasons, and none of them is a good one. The first is the war itself. Korea came too soon after the Second World War and ended too soon before Vietnam, without a victory parade, and Americans put it away so quickly that it acquired a name, the Forgotten War. The second is the men. Merchant seamen were civilians. They did not get veteran status, did not get the medals and the parades, and mostly did not ask. And the third reason is the captain, who took the one life that could have made him famous and used it to keep quiet. It takes a monastery to bury a story this size. He found one. But it is not buried anymore. In 2019, the Catholic Diocese of Paterson, New Jersey, formally opened the cause for the canonization of Brother Marinus, Leonard LaRue, which is the first step on the long road to sainthood, and which means that somewhere in the Vatican, there is now a file about a freighter captain. In Korea, the story is taught. In America, a handful of books, a documentary, a few merchant marine memorials, and the stubborn work of men like Robert Lunny have kept it alive. And every December 23rd at 11 in the morning, there are people in 2 countries who think about a whistle sounding in a harbor that no longer exists. Here is what the story is not about. It is not about a miracle in the sense of something that happened without human hands. Everything that happened on the Meredith Victory happened because somebody did it. A colonel who found room, a doctor who would not stop counting, a captain who said yes, a first mate who knelt down in the dark, 44 other men who did not sleep for 4 days, and 14,000 people who stood in a steel box without panicking for 28 hours and shared a tin cup of water down a line. LaRue would have said that was the miracle. That is not the same as saying it was easy. It is saying that it was possible and that they did it. Had you ever heard of the Meredith Victory before today? Tell me in the comments, and tell me where you're from, because I want to know how far this story has traveled and how far it hasn't. If you had a relative at Hungnam, on the beach, on the ships, in the perimeter, I'd like to hear that too. The people who were there are almost gone now. What they did is not. And the next time someone tells you that one ship or one person cannot make a difference against numbers that large, you'll have something to say. 14,000 people walked off a ship built for 12. They walked off into a country that would take them into lives that would produce presidents and grandmothers, and a man named Kimchi 5 who says thank you for his life. Not one of them was a number to the man on the bridge, who kept a pistol in one pocket and a rosary in the other and used neither, who said the course and the speed and nothing else, and who spent the rest of his life making sure that if anyone remembered the Meredith Victory, they would remember the ship and the people, and not him. That is the whole miracle. It took a monastery to keep it quiet, and it almost worked.